Yeah, I'm Cliff Hammond, and I noticed that as soon as Tony went to this slide with my face on it, participation dropped dramatically. So I'll get off this slide quickly. We'll go to the next one. Well, I'm finishing up today. I'm the last speaker, and hopefully everybody's learned a lot of great stuff about everything else these guys talked about. And Amanda, I thought, started off with some really good information on unemployment. But, I'm going to tell you about how you can't fire anybody anymore. So don't worry about unemployment because the rules are so technical and tough that if you do it, you're just going to go straight to court if you don't watch yourself. So I start off here with the religious accommodation. Major change happened in June. And I don't think that employers sometimes appreciate some of these Supreme Court decisions because everything's at a level 10. Everything is outrageous. And so we miss the things that actually are big. And this is a big one. It used to be way back in the 70s, the mid 70s, late 70s, there was a case from TWA, the airline. And it basically said, look, if somebody asked for an accommodation because of their religion, then you don't really have to take it quite as serious, right? You could use what they called de minimis. It's just not that much. If it somehow impairs the employer a little bit, we don't really have to do that. There was a lot different standard than that, for that, than there was for a disability. But here in this new decision from Groff, they said, no, you've been misreading that. We're not overturning it. We're saying you're putting too much emphasis on that part of the case. And they're saying basically, you have to look at the substantial issue of how the overall context of an employer's business would be affected if a person says, I need off on Sunday. So our friends here at the Supreme Court have been up to a lot lately, obviously, but the one thing they wanted to do is make clear unanimously that they think that we've done it the wrong way. We've been reading the cases that the Supreme Court itself put out, and the other courts across the country have all been interpreting consistently for 30, 40 years. And it's all our fault. We should have known from the very beginning that that's not what we should do. What we should be doing when it comes to an accommodation is get rid of that de minimis standard. Even though it says it in the case, get rid of that, okay? We need to show that the accommodation in the old one, you say, would do anything. So let's just say if somebody said, I can't work on Sunday because that's my day I go to church, then you would look at it and say, can you accommodate it? The employer would say, well, no, we can't really do that because it would cause overtime. A little bit, but not a lot, but it would probably cause some overtime because we don't have that many employees. And so that potentially would be enough to be able to get over an accommodation. And that's just, basically what happened for years and years. Now with this new decision, what the court is saying is, no, that's not the case. You've got to look at it under the totality of the circumstances and see whether or not that request will rise to an excessive cost. Is it to an unjustifiable level? So what's the problem with letting somebody just swap shifts? Ask for volunteers to swap shifts for them. Maybe even ask the person, would they like to be laterally assigned to another position? So they're asking you to do more than just de minimis. They're actually asking you to make sure that it's not going to impose an undue hardship. Now, frankly, it's not that much different than what we do for other types of accommodations. It's just much different than what we've done in the past. And they're saying and they're signaling they're working very carefully. Now, in this case, they sent it back to the court to identify what the problem is, because in this Groff case, Groff basically said, I work for the post office and I just kind of want to have Sundays off because that's my day I go to church. And they tried to work with him for a while, but then they found that it's just not working. It's causing too much disruption. It's too hard. We just can't get this going forever. We can do it for a little bit. We're not going to do it. And so if somebody quits, they can come back and say, I was essentially terminated constructively because of your policy of not reasonably accommodating my religious request. So now we have to go back and we have to train our managers. If somebody asks for Sunday off, you can't say, hey, when I was your age or when I was starting with the company, I had to work all the Sundays. Wish I could have had them off. Hey, my kids have baseball games. I wish I had them off, but that's just the way it goes. Tough. That's not okay. That's going to get you sued. And if people quit, let alone get fired, or they get demoted, or if something bad happens to them, they can bring a religious accommodation case. And it's a major shift. Let me give you an example. Johnny comes in. Johnny says, look, I went off Sunday because that's the day I go to church. I take it very seriously. It's something I believe 2,000 years. We've all been doing this within my religion. Give me off Sunday. And you say, I'm sorry, we can't do that because it's going to impose a hardship on us because we're going to have somebody else do it. And frankly, I don't want to ask everybody because everybody's working so hard. Well, that's going to be a problem potentially. Now, you have to be able to show that that request is literally going to have a impact on your business is so significant, not that it's going to cost a little bit, but that it's going to have a significant impact when you look at all the totality of the circumstances and that it's unjustifiable. Did you go out and you ask somebody else if they could work? Did you give that person an opportunity to go find somebody to switch with them, switch a shift? Maybe they could work a double so it doesn't have an overtime or doesn't have an impact. Did you give them a chance to maybe look at an open position where they don't have to work on a Sunday? Those are the things we've got to be able to do. Now, let's just say John comes in, asks for that day off. We say, you know what, we can do that. We can work with you. We'll work things out. We'll make sure we do it. And John comes back and says, I've been looking at the good book, and, Sabbath really hasn't changed. Actually, sundown Friday through sundown Saturday is still a Sabbath. So I need off Sunday because that's traditionally the day, we go to church, Sunday. And that's my tradition. Also, I need off the Sabbath. Can't work on the Sabbath. But I'm free to work after sundown on Saturday and before sundown on Friday, but just don't schedule me there and I'm good. You go, wait a minute, you want it off Sunday. You can't have 2 days. You can't do that. You literally got to sit there and say, okay, can we continue to do these switches? Can we continue to work with you? And if you can't show that it rises to an excessive level or cost, it's unjustifiable to the EEOC's satisfaction, then you could have a claim of discrimination. Now John comes back and says, I appreciate Saturday off, the Sabbath, and I appreciate Sunday off. But I've been reading Psalms and it says I'm supposed to make a joyful noise unto the Lord. So I'm joining the choir, and the choir only practices from 2 to 3 on Thursdays. Most of the members are in the senior center and retired, but I'm not. And I want to join. And that's the only time we can join. I want to be in the choir. And it's very important to my religious belief that I must do this. Not that I want to do it, but I believe I actually must do this. It's my sincerely held religious belief. It's going to take me 45 minutes to go there and 45 minutes to get back. So I can't work in a big block on Thursday afternoon. If that's a sincerely held religious belief, now we're looking at a third accommodation. And you can't say, well, you had off Saturday, you had off Sunday. Now I got to give you off Thursday. That's too much. You've got to be able to show why that's too much. Did you go through the same analysis? So again, I'm not saying that it can't be shown that it's undue hardship because we do this all the time with an ADA request, things of that. But we do need to kind of change the way we look at things because this is a fairly significant change in how the law applies. So we can see everything becomes a little bit more complicated, a little bit more difficult when the standard gets higher, and it has. It's risen pretty high. So we just go from there and we look at this. And now religious accommodation can also go to COVID. Now, I know a lot of people think the whole COVID restrictions and the vaccination requirements are all over, but that's not true for every workplace. And it's not 100% behind us. And this decision will have an impact potentially on how we move forward with COVID. Because if you remember, there were flu vaccines before COVID-19 that continued to be an issue. And then COVID came in and people say, hey, I don't want to take the COVID-19 vaccine. And some employers are saying you do need to take a COVID vaccine. And some people say, well, how does that work? I don't know how I can make somebody do it. Actually, the EEOC was watching this case very clearly. Not only did they put out some guidance on what happens with somebody's request, they actually went to their website with the COVID-19 FAQs and updated it. And as soon as you go to that website, you will see a big text blog that says this. The Groff opinion clarified that showing more than de minimis cost does not suffice to establish undue hardship. Instead, they go into as shown when a burden is substantial in the overall context of the business, taking into account all relevant factors. So what the EEOC is saying is, if you have COVID restrictions and require people to do certain things, such as being vaccinated, you have to take Groff into consideration now, and it's heightened requirements. So I was thinking, well, maybe that wouldn't be the case, because, maybe it's something else. And they said, no, we're not only going to do it here, we're going to put the same disclaimer on our religious accommodation page. So the EEOC has taken note to say, we're taking this into account. The Supreme Court said, we think the EEOC's current standards are probably going to be good enough if you follow them. So if you go to the EEOC, you'll see guidance that actually the Supreme Court has said, hey, take a look at this. This will help you so that you understand what to do if you have one of these religious accommodation cases. So I've got the link here, so you can go in and take a look and see how that process works. And again, court cases may come down and tighten it up a little bit. But going back to the COVID guidance, so you look at the religious accommodation, you look at the accommodation, you say, okay, the publication remains relevant now. So if you're thinking COVID doesn't matter because the emergency, the public health emergency ended May 11th, you're wrong. What the EEOC is saying is we still think COVID guidance is relevant, and we believe that it is important for you to be able to look at something and have a guidance on how to act. So what we have to do is continue to say, we thought maybe the public health emergency might change everything from an employer's ability to enforce these type of restrictions, and that's not the case. They've said you can continue to do it under certain circumstances. So we have a lot of threads that are coming together. One, the Supreme Court says it's not overruling old decisions, it's just interpreting the case the way it should have been interpreted, and the courts have misinterpreted it, that employers have to be more accommodating and at least go through a bigger process, that the COVID standards continue. The COVID standards themselves continue to be enforced by the EEOC, including for religious accommodations, and that we have to continue on. And we have to be very vigilant about these things. So even when we thought things were settled, they're not necessarily settled, and things that were settled, we have to go back and review them. So it's important to look at our religious accommodation provisions under all situations, whether it's a leave request, if it's a request for time off, if it's a request to not have a vaccination, and that could be flu, it could be COVID, it could be for anything. So just keep that in mind and make sure you're telling your supervisors they can't just dismiss somebody saying, I need a time off. And again, there are not just Sundays off, there are Saturdays off. There are people of different religious backgrounds and traditions. There are sincerely held beliefs that may require them to have different types of dietary restrictions, different types of, I don't want to participate in this event because of fill in the blank religious belief that you've never heard of before. That doesn't mean you can dismiss it. It means you have to take it serious and go through that process. All right. And we just talked about it. And again, consistent with the ADA's business necessity standard. That's the key. They're looking at the business necessity standard, and evaluation include requests for documentation on accommodations. So moving from that, we have to take a look at non-disparagement and confidentiality. And Carl, obviously, he touched a lot on this, but I wanted to talk about it because what we're talking about now is a major shift in the enforcement from the federal level of issues that there are no new laws on. There is no new law. There are just people saying you got it all wrong. And what we've gotten all wrong about is our handbooks and our non-compete agreements and our separation agreements. When we separate people and say, look, here's $2,000, go away, we're laying everybody off, we can't afford you anymore, but we do want to give you a parting gift. If you have language in there, certain language, they're saying, oh no, you got that wrong. Even though everybody's done this for 50 years, you were completely wrong in how you did it. And remember that handbook that seemed to make sense and kept everybody in order? No, that was all wrong too. And your policies and your procedures that no one's ever complained about and everybody seemed to like, they were all wrong. No new rules, you just got them all wrong. They were never hidden. Everybody knew about them. Everybody knows when they come to work what people say, what they do. Nope, it's all wrong. We have to reinvent, review, and take a look at what our non-disparagement confidentiality provisions are all about. Because what the federal government is essentially saying is talk bad about everybody. They're really saying to you, you have to have the right to go and run your boss down. Now, 15 years ago, I love this. This was a fantastic rule. You wanted this, right? I want to complain about my boss. I want to, just grovel and complain about working conditions and how we're all being overworked. And of course, now, I'm a partner now, and that's terrible. How dare you do that? So I'm on board with the NLRB. I love it. I think it's a great idea. We should do that. At the end of the day, this is saying something a little bit over the top, but it is literally what the National Labor Relations Board, which Carl talked about, is trying to protect. People's ability to complain, raise concerns, have legitimate gripes, or maybe non-legitimate gripes in the workplace about their supervisors, whether they're on the job or off the job, whether they're in the break room or whether they're on social media, whether they're complaining after they get fired or while they're still employed. These are all under the NLRB's auspices, and it doesn't matter if you are a union, non-union. Now, there have been some questions coming in about public employers. Public employers are not governed by the National Labor Relations Board generally. So a state or a local entity, they're going to be covered by another entity. And so it's a statute called PARA. And there's an agency called MERC that oversees them, very similar to the NLRB. They haven't taken a lot of the positions on these as aggressively. They don't have general counsel memos that come out, but they do watch the NLRB's decisions to take a look at what they're doing. And they haven't said yes or no yet on these, but we do have to watch some of these positions. Notably, as Carl was talking about, National Labor Relations Board has issued a number of memorandums, and he talked about a lot of them. But just having a non-disparagement provision in a separation agreement is unlawful if it's not properly drafted. Just having it in there is unlawful on its own. And you say, well, what's the deal? Well, who cares? I put it in there. What's going to happen? I don't know. Maybe they undo the agreement. Maybe they get rid of it so you can go sue. Or maybe they make you pay their rent. I don't know. There's lots of disciplines and there's lots of potential issues that can come out of this. But if you thought that the reason you gave somebody 2 weeks' salary is because you just want them to be quiet, not talk about us anymore and go our separate ways, this tells you, the NLRB says, stop doing that. And that's why a lot of people got severance agreements in the first place. You would say, look, I don't think I did anything wrong. I think we treated this person with respect. I think the person just unfortunately didn't work out here. We said, goodbye, but they're always grousing, and we just don't want that person all over the place talking bad about us. We won't talk bad about them. We'll go our separate ways. Everybody will be happy. Well, you got to be careful. Now, this applies generally to non-supervisors, as Carl was talking about earlier. There's a definition about who that is. But it's a big deal. If you wanted to do that, you're going to have a problem. Now, if you have a high-level CEO or a high-level officer or somebody in your company or a high-level supervisor, this really isn't going to apply. But why that difference between the NLRB and MERC makes a difference is that if MERC and state employers and public employers and their local employers, if they were to adopt this down the road soon, which they might, then that would mean that in a public sector environment, that might be unlawful. Because against a supervisor as well, because they cover supervisors in MERC. MERC actually can have unionized supervisors. So they're very high-level people can't be. In addition, certain confidentiality provisions in agreements are unlawful. And there was actually a case here in Michigan about this. They went to the NLRB. So if you tell somebody, I don't want you to talk about how much money you got here, generally that was okay. You could say, don't talk about the monetary value of the settlement. But the NLRB's had a long-term policy saying, but I'm not going to stop you from talking about the fact you got to settle. And people would say, well, why would I have a settlement if people go around and talk to you? It doesn't seem fair. And again, I could tell you that there are a lot of thoughts from the NLRB's position, but we'll get that in a minute. But that's where they've been. Now they're saying you can't have certain confidentiality provisions throughout it that are just too broad, right? You can't have that in there because what they're saying happens is that employees have the right to complain. They should have the right to go to the next employer and complain about what happened at their last employer, or to be able to talk to others about unionizing. And these restrict those rights. So you have to be very careful when you're an employer not to trample on people's rights. And again, supervisors versus non-supervisors depends. Now, what the prohibition disclosure of the terms of a severance agreement look at is how broad is the non-disclosure? How long is the non-disclosure? Is it about employment? Is it about things that are not employment? So what the NLRB is looking at is, did you carve out protected activity? Did you say, but you can still engage in protected activity? Who does this cover? Does it cover employees that are supervisors? Does it cover employees talking to other employees? And how long does this last? These are important issues, okay? So you have to be careful, because what the NLRB said is non-disparagement clauses that are too broad, that an employee can't make any statements that would disparage or harm the image of the employer. That's an unfair labor practice. So if you have that in your separation agreements, if you have that in any type of policy, the NLRB is going to look very unfavorably on you as trampling on the rights of employees. So you have to be careful what your handbooks say and what your supervisors say. And that whole disparaging the image of an employer has been a central theme of the NLRB since the Obama administration. And if you go back, you will see there's a memo that was written by the then general counsel, head attorney for the NLRB, and they had a case they settled with Wendy's, and they looked at their handbook and went through it, and they said, here are provisions we found that were unlawful, here are provisions we found that were lawful over the years, here are the provisions in this handbook that we have a problem with and ones that are okay. And they explained it. And one of the common themes throughout is you can't tell employees they can't complain about their workplace. You can't tell employees that they can't go out and grouse about their working conditions, their supervisors. Just saying you can't be insubordinate in itself in a vacuum that's an unfair labor practice. You have to write it the right way. You have to be mindful that they want you to be laser focused. And if not, the person can come back and file a charge against you and try to undo the separation agreement, the settlement agreement, or whatever you have, or find that your handbook is oppressive on them. Now I want to move forward to monitoring employees. And the question comes up a lot, can I watch my employees while they're at work? You would assume you can do that, right? They're employees. They are on your dime. They are literally people that you're responsible for. And if they do something wrong, it actually could have problems for the company. It could have problems for you individually if someone's doing something that could hurt, harm themselves or others, or help, hurt the reputation of the company. Now, historically, the answer was, yeah, go out there, watch people, make sure you're supervising. That's what supervisors are for, right? You have to do that. You can monitor the use of company equipment and computers. It's been done forever, but you have to be aware of the NLRB. You have to be aware, you have to be cognizant that things have changed. There's a memorandum that, in addition to the ones that Carl talked about, that says, look, we're looking at it, and this is going into Tony's presentation. As we have better equipment, as we have better technology to watch the keystrokes, and cameras and radio frequency badges and all these AI tools, the photos, the webcam photographs, the auto recordings to monitor efficiency, okay? Those are now squarely within the NLRB's crosshairs. They're saying, knock it off. What are you doing? And if you monitor with visual, it used to be that was fine, but now you have to be careful audio so that you don't breach any of the laws. But you have to be careful now. The NLRB is saying, we're seeing you getting more and more automated in the way you watch people. And if you're a non-union facility in a private sector, you have to be careful, because these are things we've done for, I guess, the last 20 years. We've really been using this to help us monitor the efficiency of the company. You want to make sure that people are doing their job, they're doing it well, they're doing it effectively. We can monitor how we can get better. We can find out how can we be more profitable. How can we keep the business growing and hire more people? These seem to be common sense ways to help the business. And the NLRB is saying, we're watching you there, and we've got a little bit of a problem with the way you're doing it. Because what they say, and this is a quote from the NLRB, close, constant surveillance and management through electronic means threaten employees' basic ability to exercise their rights under the National Labor Relations Act. So if you literally do a good job monitoring and supervising your employees, you're probably getting close to unlawfully surveilling your employees from engaging in their acts. And it's a surprising position And I don't know, it's relatively new, if they've been reading Das Capital or why they do this. But at the end of the day, they've come to the conclusion that if you're constantly watching your employees using technology, then those employees are probably not going to be able to go out and talk about how they don't like this technology, how they want to unionize, how they want to file a grievance, how they want to do something concerted to go against you, because they never have a chance. Wherever they go, whatever they do, it's always under constant surveillance. And that's a back and forth argument between management and the employers. In fact, if the surveillance extends into a break time in non-work areas, and you have disciplines and ways to go against people for excessive workloads and prevent workers from talking during their breaks, they're really going to come down on you and say, why are you taking a break? I saw that you took a break for 15 minutes and you were falling behind. We've been watching you very closely. That's something they're coming after. And when the board looked at it, they said, we understand businesses have to be efficient. We're not saying, we're telling you can't monitor people. We're not telling you can't use technology. But what we are saying, that is, if you argue that you have an interest, we've got to evaluate those competing interests. And we have to figure out whether you're using, quote, the least destructive one as is consistent with the maintenance of the other. So in other words, are you using the least destructive means of monitoring your employees to get the issue you want resolved done? So in other words, they're coming in and saying, you're doing a really good job. Can you do it less effectively? Can you do it without watching people a little bit less? This is crazy, okay? This is way out there. Now, again, this is a memorandum from the general counsel saying we're going to go out there and look at it, but it does give you a view of where they're going to go. It gives you an idea of what they're going to try to come after. And if you're a business that's trying to monitor people and you're trying to get more effective and efficient, you have to be mindful that these things come back to bite you. If you discipline people based on productivity, if you're watching them constantly, they're going to fight back. And they say at the NLRB that you have to have practices that are narrowly tailored to address a legitimate business need, not just that you generally want to be more efficient. So that's a big change in the way you would think, especially what Tony was talking about with AI, right? With the advances that we have in technology, you're going to have a real quandary now, because we're going to have amazing tools to measure productivity that if they get too broad, they actually become the problem. So the union's, looking at you, all right, and they're saying, okay, you have a unionized workforce. How do we negotiate it? Well, there are rules about that. You can't just put up cameras sometimes without negotiating with the union, because that's actually something that is it's changing from a general employee, an individual, a supervisor watching them, to automation. That's been going on for a long time. And now we're expanding this out to a larger issue. Okay, so we just got to be careful about this. And it's not something that you generally would think about, but we do have to think about those. Oh, sorry about that. Now, here's another thing. When we watch employees, if a person is complaining about your new software, your new tracking device, your new anything, that is an unfair labor practice too. People are allowed to complain and raise concerns about your new technology. This goes then into the next issue of monitoring employees, which is you cannot require employees in the state of Michigan to ask an employee to grant you access to their personal internet account. Can you monitor somebody's company internet access? Yes. So if I'm on the company's internet and say email, and they have an email, I can obviously do that. But what the NLRB is saying is you have to tell the people, they're requiring you, tell individuals what you're monitoring, how you're monitoring them, why you're monitoring them, why you need it, and essentially have it an open process. So there's no secrets that are being kept, and narrowly tailor that so that you need it. Michigan is telling you, even if you get all those things done, you have to go out and you cannot ask people to have access to their Facebook. You cannot have access to their personal coded email system. So be very careful. All right. This is different than public information. So private information, you can't ask for personal interest. If it's company emails, you can monitor those emails, but you have to be careful. And then you have a union versus non-use of cameras that we talked about. And there's expectations of privacy in some areas like bathrooms, places people would change. And, we have to talk about, and we will at the very end, the fact that it's probably a great idea to tell people that they should not have an expectation of privacy in non-bathroom, non-changing settings, right? Not in a locker room, things of that nature. But you have to explain where they should not have an expectation of privacy so that people know. Now, GPS tracking is another issue. A lot of times employers are using GPS tracking to watch vehicles to make sure that those vehicles are being used properly, that they're efficiently being used. The NLRB is looking at that too, saying, wait a minute, what are we doing here? Why are we just watching random employees? How do we know they're not stopping off down at the Teamsters Hall or at their union hall or going to a meeting of concerted activity? Why do you need that tracking? And they are very frustrated with employers who are just randomly using technology to basically browbeat their employees for every second of their life. And they say it interferes with their rights. And Michigan has, rules, and other states have rules. If you operate in other rules, you have to be very careful because every state has the right to have its own laws. And as you go across state lines or you transact or you have remote employees, obviously we have a lot of employees, each state has its own unique laws. As Mike was talking about earlier, we have lots of laws and lots of issues that are going on here about the ABC test for joint employers versus employees. Who is your boss and who is your employee is a very dynamic question that we've got to resolve so that we don't get ourselves in trouble monitoring employees unlawfully that don't live in the state of Michigan. So even if you are small enough that you're not even under the National Labor Relations Board, but you have remote employees, you still could get yourself in trouble if your employee lives in New York, California, Oregon, somebody like that, and you could have trouble. But what about an employee vehicle versus a company vehicle? You have to be very careful, and there are statutes on this, and we have certain statutes, and I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but we have statutes about monitoring employees, and you have to be very careful what you can and you can't do with respect to employee vehicles and company vehicles. If an employee has a vehicle, there are rules about what you can and can't do to that person's GPS tracking. If it's a company vehicle, generally you can watch that vehicle, but if it's not, you have to have notice and opportunity for that person to respond. So hold on one second. So the bottom line is that you have to have a best practice in your handbook. Your handbook is the way that you guide people, but it's also something that gets you in trouble. Try not to have the most verbose handbook in the world about how employees need to do everything, and here's exactly what we're going to do. We want to try to make it a guidebook. We want to tell them what they need to do, what they don't need to do. But what I notice when we review handbooks today, we will find isolated policies and practices that do not actually address the problems that the company has. Instead, they just sit there and attract the attention of different government agencies to say that it's wrong. So when we draft our policies, they need to be crisp, concise, and to the point. Remember, if you have at-will employees, you can fire them for any reason, no reason at all. We want to have discipline and procedures that make sense, that don't attract any problems. We have to have our handbooks in place. And I would say if you're going to monitor people, if you're going to monitor employees, then you need to make sure, if you can, to let them know that they could be monitored. They should have no expectations. And it's nice to have notices to people. That way they can't say, I did not know. So those are the type of best practices that I recommend that we utilize in the workplace, because without those, we can get ourselves in trouble with the new changes that are coming around. So with that, I guess we have about a half an hour left for any questions, but I think we have a, hopefully, a pretty robust amount of information here that we've gone over that people can understand and use and try to, I guess, amend their policies, update the way they look at things, and train their managers to make sure that they avoid any of these pitfalls.